Kimmel laughed with Ocasio-Cortez. He's just a bored kid. Barron went live and flipped the script. They laughed at him on national television. Jimmy Kimmel and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat under studio lights, their voices dripping with condescension as they dismissed Barron Trump as just a bored kid, a privileged teenager with nothing to say and nowhere to go. The audience roared with approval. The clip went viral within hours, shared across platforms with mocking commentary and smug satisfaction. Political pundits nodded in agreement. Late-night comedy had spoken. The youngest Trump was nothing more than a footnote, a shadow in his father's sprawling empire, a curiosity without consequence. They thought they knew the story. They were wrong, because while they laughed, Barron was watching, and more importantly, he was preparing. The world had underestimated him from the beginning. At 18 years old, standing 6'9" with a mind sharper than anyone gave him credit for, Barron had spent years in the background silent, observing, learning, while his father dominated headlines and his siblings navigated business empires. Barron existed in a strange liminal space between public fascination and invisibility. Photographers captured his height. Commentators speculated about his future. But nobody truly listened. Nobody imagined that behind those calculating eyes lived a young man who had been taking notes on power, media, and the art of controlling narratives since before he could drive. The Kimmel interview aired on a Tuesday night. By Wednesday morning, the internet was ablaze with reactions. Ocasio-Cortez's quip, delivered with a smile that suggested she believed she was punching up, became a rallying cry for those who saw the Trump family as symbols of inherited privilege devoid of substance. "He's just a bored kid playing with daddy's toys," she had said, leaning back in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed the mic was hers to control. Kimmel had laughed, that rehearsed late-night laugh, and the audience had followed like a chorus trained to respond on cue. But something else was happening beneath the surface of the viral moment. In encrypted group chats and private Discord servers, a different conversation was building. Young conservatives, Gen Z contrarians, digital natives who had grown tired of being told what to think, they weren't laughing, they were paying attention. And when Barron announced via a single cryptic Instagram story that he would be going live at 8 p.m. Eastern, the whispers turned into a roar. Nobody knew what to expect. Barron Trump had no public social media presence beyond carefully curated family photos. He had never given an interview. He had never spoken publicly about politics, culture, or his own beliefs. He was, in the eyes of mainstream media, a tall, quiet figure who existed only as a subject of speculation and dismissal. The idea that he would suddenly step into the spotlight, unscripted and unfiltered, seemed almost absurd. Yet when the notification appeared across multiple platforms simultaneously, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter Spaces, even TikTok, millions of people paused what they were doing. The thumbnail was simple: Barron sitting in a minimalist room, direct eye contact with the camera, no theatrics, no production frills. The title read, "They laughed. Now listen." Within minutes, the viewer count climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Tech journalists scrambled to write hot takes. Political strategists refreshed their feeds. Late-night writers who had mocked him hours before suddenly found themselves watching in real time, uncertain whether this was a disaster in the making or something else entirely. The chat boxes exploded with reactions, supporters typing fire emojis, critics predicting a meltdown, journalists hunting for the angle that would define tomorrow's news cycle. And then Barron spoke. His voice was calm, measured, nothing like the caricature they had drawn. No anger, no defensiveness, no desperate need for validation, just clarity. He addressed Kimmel and Ocasio-Cortez by name, not with hostility but with the precision of someone who had studied their playbook and found it lacking. He spoke about media narratives, about performative politics, about the assumptions people make when they think someone isn't paying attention. He didn't shout, he didn't need to, because in that moment, the script flipped. The bored kid had become the storyteller. And the world, whether it wanted to or not, was listening. What would he say next? And more importantly, what had they unleashed? The first 30 seconds changed everything. While political strategists expected stumbling, fumbling, the nervous energy of an 18-year-old thrust into a spotlight he never asked for, Barron delivered something else entirely. Controlled, he sat upright, camera positioned perfectly at eye level, no nervous tics or fidgeting hands. His opening line cut through the noise with surgical precision. "I've been called a lot of things: privileged, disconnected, irrelevant. Tonight, I'm here to tell you what I actually am. Someone who's been listening while everyone else was performing." The live stream numbers exploded. Within 5 minutes, over 2 million viewers had tuned in across platforms. Twitter erupted into chaos, half convinced this was performance art, half genuinely shocked that the kid they'd dismissed as a decorative tall boy in family photos had media presence that rivaled seasoned politicians. News desks scrambled. CNN interrupted regular programming with a Chiron reading. Barron Trump breaks silence. MSNBC analysts debated whether to cover it at all or dismiss it as a publicity stunt. Fox News played it in full, faces of anchors betraying genuine surprise. Barron didn't waste time on grievances. He acknowledged the Kimmel clip directly, playing a segment of it on screen behind him. Ocasio-Cortez's dismissive laughter, the audience's performative agreement, the smug certainty that comes from believing you control the narrative. Then he paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to create discomfort. "I don't blame them for underestimating me," he said, voice steady and measured. "People see what they want to see. But underestimation is a gift. It means you get to observe without being observed. You get to learn without being tested. And when the moment comes, you get to show them exactly what they missed." He spoke about growing up in a fishbowl, about learning early that every gesture would be analyzed, every photograph dissected for meaning. He described standing silently at political rallies while adults projected assumptions onto him, assuming boredom when he was calculating, assuming detachment when he was cataloging every rhetorical trick, every applause line, every calculated pause. "They thought I wasn't paying attention," he said with the faintest hint of a smile. "I was paying attention to everything." Then came the pivot that turned casual viewers into captivated ones. Barron began dissecting modern political theater with the precision of someone who had been studying it from the inside. He talked about performative outrage, about how late-night comedy had become less about humor and more about tribal signaling. He mentioned Kimmel by name, not with anger, but with analytical detachment, pointing out how the same jokes get recycled, how the same targets get mocked, how predictability, masquerading as bravery, becomes the safest career move in entertainment. And then he addressed Ocasio-Cortez directly, not with the vitriol she might have expected, but with something more dangerous. Respect laced with critique. Representative Ocasio-Cortez is intelligent, charismatic, and skilled at using media to amplify her message, he said, each word deliberate. But calling me a bored kid while sitting on a late-night show promoting your brand isn't punching up. It's just punching. And when you punch down at someone you've never spoken to, you're not being brave, you're being lazy. The chat exploded. Supporters flooded the comments with approval. Critics accused him of entitlement. Journalists began drafting hot takes before he'd even finished speaking. But the most important shift was happening beneath the surface. People were actually listening. Not hate-watching, not waiting for him to stumble. Listening. Barron knew it too. You could see it in the subtle relaxation of his shoulders. The quiet confidence that comes from realizing you've captured something rare, genuine attention in an age of infinite distraction. He leaned slightly forward, as if sharing a secret. "I've spent my whole life being told who I am by people who've never asked. Tonight, I'm telling you myself. And if that makes you uncomfortable, good. Comfort is where narratives go to die." He announced that this would not be a one-time event. He would continue going live, unscripted and unfiltered, every week. No handlers, no teleprompters, no focus-grouped talking points. Just conversation, analysis, and the kind of honesty that terrifies political operatives on both sides. The final shot before the stream ended was simple. Barron, looking directly into the camera. No smile, no performance. Just presence. The screen went black. The internet detonated. Within minutes, #BarronSpeaks trended worldwide. Clips circulated faster than fact-checkers could contextualize them. Political opponents scrambled to craft responses. Supporters declared a new voice had emerged. And somewhere, in a late-night writer's room, Jimmy Kimmel stared at his phone, watching his own clip being weaponized by the exact person he'd underestimated. The bored kid had just rewritten the rules. And nobody, not Kimmel, not Ocasio-Cortez, not the armies of commentators who made careers from dismissing him, knew what came next. The morning after the livestream, America woke up to a media landscape it didn't recognize. Barron Trump's face dominated every news cycle, not as a background figure in family photos, but as the main event. Cable news panels debated what it meant. Think pieces proliferated across digital publications. Political operatives on both sides scrambled to determine whether this was threat or opportunity. But the most significant shift wasn't happening in boardrooms or studios. It was happening in living rooms, dorm rooms, and bedrooms where Gen Z scrolled through their feeds and saw something they rarely encountered in political discourse. Someone their age speaking without a script. Within 24 hours, #BarronSpeaks had generated over 15 million engagements across platforms. TikTok creators dissected clips from the livestream, some mocking, others genuinely impressed. Instagram Reels spliced together his most quotable moments against dramatic music. YouTube commentary channels that typically focused on gaming or lifestyle content suddenly pivoted to political analysis. Their audiences hungry for takes on this unexpected cultural moment. The algorithm gods smiled upon controversy. And controversy was exactly what Barron had delivered, not through scandal, but through the simple act of refusing to play by established rules. Jimmy Kimmel addressed the situation on his show 3 days later, forced by network executives who understood that silence would be interpreted as defeat. He opened with a joke, something about tall teenagers and low engagement, but the laughter from his studio audience felt manufactured, obligatory. When he finally addressed Barron's critique directly, his tone shifted from comedy to something resembling defensiveness. Look, we make jokes here. That's the job. If someone can't handle being part of the conversation, maybe they're not ready for the spotlight they're clearly seeking. The applause was polite, but muted. On Twitter, the clip was immediately juxtaposed with Barron's measured response, and the comparison was not kind to Kimmel. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took a different approach. During a press conference ostensibly about climate policy, a reporter asked about Barron's life. She paused, visibly recalibrating, then delivered what her team had clearly prepared: acknowledgement without concession. I appreciate anyone engaging in political discourse, especially young people. If Barron Trump wants to use his platform for substantive conversation, I think that's positive. I'd welcome the opportunity to have that conversation directly rather than through media intermediaries. It was politically savvy, extending an olive branch while maintaining moral high ground, but the internet saw through the performance. Within hours, memes circulated showing her Kimmel appearance alongside her press conference response, captioned with variations of "when the bored kid starts paying attention." But Barron didn't respond immediately. That was the brilliance of his strategy. While everyone waited for him to strike back, to engage in the performative combat that defines modern political theater, he simply lived his life. Photographs emerged of him at NYU, walking to class with the same unbothered energy he'd displayed before the livestream. Paparazzi shouted questions. He ignored them. Journalists camped outside his residence building. He entered and exited through alternate routes. The refusal to feed the frenzy became its own statement. He controlled the narrative by choosing when to participate in it. 2 weeks after the initial stream, he went live again. No announcement, no promotional build-up, just a notification that appeared across platforms at 9 p.m. on a Thursday. This time, over 3 million people tuned in within the first minute. He opened with a simple acknowledgement: "I see the conversation has continued." Good, that was the point. Then he did something unexpected. He brought on a guest. Not a political operative or celebrity endorsement, but Dr. Melissa Chen, a relatively unknown professor of media studies from Stanford, who had published extensively on parasocial relationships and performative politics. For 45 minutes, they discussed how social media had transformed political engagement, how authenticity had become commodified, how the line between genuine advocacy and personal branding had blurred beyond recognition. It wasn't flashy. There were no zingers or viral moments engineered for clip culture. It was just substantive, and that substance terrified the establishment more than any attack could have. Because, if political discourse could exist outside the traditional frameworks, outside the late-night monologues and cable news panels and carefully staged town halls, then the gatekeepers who profited from those frameworks suddenly became obsolete. The livestream ended with Barron addressing his critics directly. Some people think this is about revenge or ego. It's not. It's about showing that you don't need permission to be part of the conversation. You don't need credentials from institutions that profit from keeping you out. You just need something to say, and the willingness to say it without asking if it's allowed. He paused, that slight smile returning. They laughed because they thought I had nothing to contribute. I'm here because I know I do. And more importantly, so do millions of other people who've been told to wait their turn. The screen faded to black. The internet exploded again. But this time, something had shifted. The mocking had diminished, replaced by genuine engagement. Even critics had to acknowledge what was happening. A new model of political communication was being born in real time, built not on institutional authority but on direct connection. Barron Trump, the bored kid dismissed by late-night comedians and progressive politicians, had done what few people in public life managed. He'd changed the conversation simply by refusing to accept the terms everyone else agreed upon. And Jimmy Kimmel, watching from his carefully lit studio, realized that the joke was no longer funny, because the punchline had just rewritten itself. 6 months after the Kimmel laugh heard around the internet, Barron Trump sat in the same minimalist room where he'd first gone live. But the landscape around him had fundamentally transformed. His weekly live streams had become appointment viewing for millions, not just Gen Z provocateurs or political junkies, but people across demographics who'd grown exhausted by the performative theater that passed for political discourse. He'd interviewed economists, activists, philosophers, even a former Supreme Court clerk who broke down constitutional law in language anyone could understand. No partisan talking points. No manufactured outrage. Just conversation that treated audiences like adults capable of complex thought. The establishment's response had evolved from mockery to concern to something resembling panic. Late-night ratings had begun to slide. particularly among younger viewers who increasingly found their political analysis on platforms where authenticity mattered more than polish. Jimmy Kimmel's show had lost 17% of its key demographic in the months following the initial incident. Advertisers started asking uncomfortable questions about return on investment. When the cultural conversation was happening elsewhere, network executives held emergency meetings about relevance, strategy, and digital integration. Corporate speak for the dawning realization that the gatekeepers no longer controlled the gates. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, ever the political savant, had pivoted gracefully. She'd appeared on Barron's stream 3 months prior, not as an adversary, but as a participant in genuine dialogue. They'd disagreed on economics, found common ground on institutional reform, and demonstrated what political discourse could look like when participants prioritized understanding over scoring points. The clip had generated 40 million views. Progressive commentators praised her willingness to engage. Conservative outlets grudgingly acknowledged the substance. And most importantly, viewers walked away more informed rather than more enraged. It was revolutionary precisely because it was so simple. Traditional media attempted to replicate the model, launching dozens of authentic conversation segments featuring young hosts and unscripted formats. Most failed spectacularly. Audiences could smell manufactured authenticity from miles away, could recognize when spontaneous moments were carefully focus grouped and legal reviewed into submission. The difference wasn't production value or platform, it was intention. Barron had started speaking because he had something to say. The imitators spoke because their employers needed engagement metrics. The broader cultural shift was undeniable. Political influencers who built followings on performative outrage found their audiences fragmenting, migrating toward creators who offered depth alongside entertainment. University lecture halls reported increased enrollment in political science and media studies courses. Students citing Barron's conversations as inspiration. Town halls across the country experimented with direct-to-constituent streaming, bypassing traditional press coverage to speak directly to citizens. The model of intermediated political communication where journalists and entertainers interpreted and contextualized political messages was being supplemented, and in some cases replaced, by direct engagement that trusted audiences to form their own conclusions. But Barron's greatest achievement wasn't changing how politics was discussed. It was demonstrating that institutional permission was no longer required to participate meaningfully in public discourse. Every week, his comment sections filled with viewers sharing their own perspectives, creating secondary conversations that branched into forums, group chats, and eventually real-world organizing. A viewer in Michigan started a local political education initiative. A college student in Texas launched a podcast examining media bias across the political spectrum. A high school teacher in Oregon redesigned her civics curriculum around direct engagement rather than textbook repetition. The ripple effects multiplied beyond any single person's control, which was precisely the point. On this particular evening, 6 months and countless cultural shifts later, Barron opened his stream with a reflection. When Jimmy Kimmel and Representative Ocasio-Cortez laughed and called me a bored kid, they weren't entirely wrong. I was bored of watching adults perform for cameras while pretending they were having conversations. Bored of political discourse that treated audiences like children who needed to be told what to think. Bored of a system that demanded credentials and institutional approval before granting permission to speak. He paused, that familiar, slight smile appearing. Turns out, I wasn't the only one who was bored. He announced that this would be his final weekly stream. Not because the experiment had failed, but because it had succeeded beyond its original intention. The conversation no longer needed him to facilitate it. Hundreds of similar initiatives had emerged, each with their own perspective and approach, collectively creating an ecosystem where direct political engagement was normalized rather than exceptional. The point was never to build an audience around me, he explained. It was to demonstrate that the conversation belongs to everyone willing to participate honestly. The final minutes of the stream featured no guests, no grand pronouncements, just Barron speaking directly to the camera about the responsibility that comes with having a voice and the importance of using it with intention. He thanked viewers not for following him, but for demanding better from their political culture. He encouraged them to create rather than consume, to engage rather than perform, to prioritize understanding over being right. The screen faded to black for the last time. Within hours, tributes flooded social media, not from politicians or celebrities, but from ordinary people who credited his example with helping them find their own voices. Jimmy Kimmel, in a moment of genuine reflection on his own show, acknowledged that he'd gotten it wrong. Sometimes the kids we dismiss are the ones paying closest attention, he said, and this time the laughter was absent. Barron Trump, the bored kid who'd been mocked on national television, had done something remarkable. He hadn't just flipped the script, he'd rewritten the entire narrative about who gets to speak, who gets to be heard, and what political discourse can become when people stop performing and start conversing. The establishment had laughed because they thought he had nothing to contribute. History would remember that they'd been spectacularly, irrevocably wrong.